Senator Menendez, thank you so much for joining us.
Agree with you.
Over the past 2 weeks, hundreds of people across the state have been protesting against police brutality after the death of George Floyd. People want to see change after a long history of racism, violence, and inequality. You're working with other lawmakers on the Justice in Policing Act. What are the major points of this legislation, and why has it taken so long for action to be taken? Would we be discussing this act had the protests not taken place?
Well, I think the tragic death of Mr. Floyd has riveted the attention of the nation in a way that, despite previous also tragic deaths, uh, has crystallized and riveted it in the attention of the nation in such a way that it is a galvanizing and, I hope, transformational moment. That is why I'm pleased to have been an original co-sponsor with my colleague, Senator Cory Booker, Senator Kamala Harris of California, and others in the Justice and Policing Act. It is far-reaching legislation and well overdue. It creates a national use of force standard against excessive force. It creates a national registry for police officers who have been convicted of misconduct in their office, so they can't go to another jurisdiction after they've committed that misconduct in one jurisdiction and then go to another and get a job there and maybe commit the same misconduct again. It has significant incentives for significant police training, de-escalation training. It incentivizes the states to create an excessive force standard where such force can only be used in the question of potential life or death moment. It limits the transfer of military weapons to police departments. And it changes, one of the most essential elements that it does is it changes the legal standard of what we call qualified immunity, so that it becomes very clear what an officer can and cannot do and the risks to that officer legally if in fact they cross the line. So we think these are just some of the elements of the law, and we think that just like in our history, civil rights legislation took a long time, but then there came a galvanizing moment. The Voting Rights Act, there came a galvanizing moment. I think this is a galvanizing moment for transformational change in the Justice and Policing Act.
Do you think, and perhaps in what you just said, you said this galvanizing moment, did it take the protests for this to occur? And I mean, truly, why has it taken so long for this to happen? Because we've been hearing about cases like this for years. I mean, Eric Gardner, I mean, they're just countless in a number of people.
Well, I mean, I think as always, the protests help broaden the scope of support for such legislation. And the broad nature of the protests, not just African Americans, but Americans of all parts of our society have come together to protest. And I think the vivid nature of the video was compelling to say this is just absolutely wrong. It's criminal at the end of the day. And so moments like that, it's like Rosa Parks, who said, "I'm not going to sit in the back of the bus," or John Lewis, who was beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, colleague of mine from the House of Representatives, an icon in the civil rights movement. This is why I think hopefully this is a moment of change. Look, we hope our Republican colleagues will join us. This is not a Democrat or Republican issue. It should be a national unity response. But it's interesting to see that Senator Tim Scott, the only African-American member of the Senate Republican caucus, is now drafting his own legislation. But at least even there is a movement to recognize that something has to be done. And so I hope that, that we will continue to have citizen participation to ensure that something does get done. And we're going to do our part here, not only in sponsoring the legislation and advocating for it, but pushing the conscience and pricking the conscience of our colleagues to ultimately support us.
Senator Menendez, what were your thoughts when President Trump decided to bring out the National Guard, talked about it, and brought it out in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I found it to be revolting and alarming. I'm the senior Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. That's the type of action we see in totalitarian countries in different parts of the world, the strongman tactics in different parts of the world, in the tactics of dictators in different parts of the world. It's not what we expect in the United States of America. It is not using military and police against peaceful civilians in their constitutional rights to protest. And so it was revolting to me and alarming that a president of our country would use such a tactic. And I'm glad to see that, in fact, it's those who participated and the highest ranks, like General Milley, have now recognized that they were wrong to do so and have publicly said so.
There have also been discussions about reevaluating police review boards. What changes do you think need to be made?
Well, one of the things that our legislation, the Justice and Policing Act, does is it incentivizes states to have independent review boards and independent reviews in general against cases like that of George Floyd and Eric Gardner and others. And so we think that that independent review is important. We think it's important for the potential victim and their families. We also think it's important for the police officer at the end of the day. And I just want to take a moment to say that even in the midst of much needed reform, when a bad police officer, as the one who caused the death of Mr. Floyd, acts the way he does, it makes it bad for all the other officers who overwhelmingly, I think, do their jobs. They do it with honor. They protect us at the end of the day. They risk their lives. But you cannot accept a code of silence. Other officers, in the case of Mr. Floyd's tragic death, should have engaged the officer that was on Mr. Floyd's neck and said, "Get off, and let's take him to the precinct." They didn't. That's unacceptable. And so we have to create a different code of conduct, and independent reviews can be helpful towards moving in that direction.
In addition to the Policing Act, are you and your colleagues in the Senate working on other laws that will create measurable and permanent change?
Well, this is pretty far reaching. It also, for example, outlaws lynching, which it's amazing to think that in the 21st century, in 2020, we would even see any of that in any part of the country, but we have. So we hope that this can be the foundation of change. But we also need, Mabel, we need changes beyond the policing elements of this, because there is a systemic challenge to the lives of those who are Black and brown in our country. If you're Black and brown in our country, as we saw in COVID-19, you are more likely to be infected by the disease because of the nature of where you live, the type of job you have that doesn't allow you. If you have no other source of income, you got to go to work to sustain your family. If you happen to be one of that universe of essential workers, and those essential workers, many of them are overwhelmingly Black and brown. If you're Black and brown, you're more likely not to be able to afford a place to call home. If you're Black and brown, you're more likely not to have the health care that you need. If you're Black and brown, you're more likely to live in a place in which there's environmental discrimination and higher rates of respiratory illnesses, which this particular infectious disease of COVID-19 strikes at those who have comorbidities like asthma and other respiratory diseases. So we also need to deal with the economic underpinnings of this issue. And that's something that, as a member of the Senate Finance and Banking Committee, I've been pushing forward with my colleagues, and hope to see some legislation that deals with that as well.
Senator Menendez, thank you so much for your time.
Good to be with you.